Animal Farm Chapter 5. Charlie became more late for work one morning and accused herself that she had overslept and she complained of mysterious pain although her appetite was on every text she would run from work and go to the drinking pool. She would stand foolishly gazing at her own reflection in the water. But there were also rumors of something worse. One day, as Molly strolled in the yard, Flynn hung down at a stalk of hay, clover to her side. Molly, she said, I have something very serious to say to you. This morning I saw you looking over the hedge that divides the farm from Wood. One of Mr. Pilkington's men was standing on the other side of the hedge, and I was a long way away, but I am almost certain I saw it. He was talking to you, and you were allowing him to nose. What does that mean, Molly? It wasn't. It isn't true. Cried Molly, beating press about and paw on the ground. Molly, in the face. You give me a word of honor that man was not stroking your nose. It isn't true, repeated Molly, but she could not look her in the face. And this moment she took her and got away into the field. He thought she struck Clover. Without anything to the other, she entered Molly's stall and turned to the straw with her hoof. Hidden in the straw was a little pot of sugar and several bunches of ribbons of different colors. 3 days later, disappeared. Suddenly, nothing was known of her whereabouts. Then the pigeon reported that they had seen her on the other side of Wellington. She was between the shafts of a small dog cart in red and black, which was standing outside a public house. A fat-faced man in cheap breeches and gaiters, who looked like a Republican, stroking her nose and feeding her sugar. Her coat was newly clipped and scarlet ribbon around her frock. "You appear to be enjoying yourself," the pigeon said. None of the animals saw me again. In January, there came bitterly hard weather. Earth was like iron, nothing could be the field. Many meetings were held in the barn and occupied themselves planning out the work of the coming season. It had come set that the pigs, who were manifestly governing the animals, should decide all for the those who had the right to mature enough for the Wildlion. We would disagree at every point. Disagreement was possible. One of them suggested sowing a acreage with barley, the other was certain to bigger acreage of oats, and one said such a field was just for cabbage. The other would declare it was anything except each zone following and their violent and Snowball often already but only were at canvassing support for himself in between times. He was especially successful with sheep. Of late, the sheep had been taken to bleeding, 4 legs good, 2 legs bad, both in and out of season, and they often interrupted the meetings with this. It was noticed that they were especially able to break into 4 legs good, 2 legs bad at crucial moments in Snowball's speeches. Snowball had made a close study of some back numbers of the farmer and stock breeder, which he had found in the farmhouse, and was full of plans for innovations and improvements. He talked learnedly about field drains, silage, and basic slag, and had worked out a complicated scheme for the animals to drop their dung directly in the fields at different every day to save the labor of cartage. Napoleon produced no schemes of his own, but said quietly that Snowball's world would come to nothing and seemed to be biding his time. But all of their controversies, none was so bitter than the one that would take place over the windmill. In the long pasture, not far from the farm buildings, there was a small knoll which was the highest point on the farm. After surveying the ground, Snowball declared that this was the place for a windmill, which could be made to operate dynamo and supply the farm with electrical power. This would light the stalls and warm them in the winter, and would also run a circular saw, a chaff cutter, a mango slicer, and electric milking machines. The animals have never heard of anything of this kind before, for the farm was an old-fashioned one and had only the most primitive machinery. They listened in astonishment while Snowball conjured up pictures of fantastic machines which would do the work for them while they grazed at their ease in the fields or improved their minds with reading and conversation. Within a few weeks, Snowball's plans for the windmill were finally worked out. The mechanical details came mostly from 3 books which had belonged to Mr. Jones: 1,000 Useful Things to Do About the House, Every Man His Own Bricklayer, and Electricity for Beginners. Snowball used as his study a shed which had once been used for incubators and had a smooth wooden floor, suitable for drawing on. He was closeted there for hours at a time, with his books held open by a stone and with a piece of chalk gripped between the wheels of his trotter. He would move rapidly to and fro, drawing in line after line and uttering little whimpers of excitement. Gradually, the plans grew into a complicated mass of cranks and cogwheels covering more than half the floor, which seemed unintelligible but impressive. All of them came to look at Snowball's drawings at least once a day. Even the hens and ducks came and were at pains not to tread on the chalk marks. Only Napoleon held aloof. He declared himself against the windmill from the start. One day, however, he arrived unexpectedly to examine the plans. He walked heavily around the shed, looked closely at every detail of the plan, and snuffed at them once or twice, then stood for a little while contemplating them out of every corner of his eye. Then suddenly he lifted his leg, urinated all over the plans, and walked out without uttering a word. The whole farm was deeply divided on the subject of the windmill. Snowball did not deny that to build it would be a difficult business. Stone would have to be carried and built up into walls, then sails would have to be made, and that there would be need for dynamos and cables. How are these to be procured? Snowball did not say, but he maintained that it could all be done in a year. And thereafter, he declared, so much labor would be saved that the animals would only need to work 3 days a week. Napoleon, on the other hand, argued that the great need of the movement was to increase food production, and if they wasted the time on the windmill, they would all starve to death. The animals formed themselves into 2 factions under the slogan, "Vote for Snowball and the 3 day a week," and "Vote for Napoleon and the full manger." Benjamin was the only animal who did not side with either faction. He refused to believe that either the food would become more plentiful or that the windmill would save work. Windmill or no windmill, he said, life would go on as it has always done. That is, badly. Apart from the disputes over the windmill, there was a question of the defense on the farm. It was fully realized that though the human beings had been defeated in the battle of the cowshed, they might make another and more attempt to recapture the farm and reinstate Mr. Jones. They had all the more reason for doing so because the news of their defeat had spread across the countryside and made the animals on the neighboring farm more restive than ever. As usual, Snowball and Napoleon were in disagreement. According to Napoleon, what the animals must do was to procure firearms and train themselves in the use of them. According to Snowball, they must send out more and more pigeons and stir up the rebellion among the animals on the other farm. The one argued that if they could not defend themselves, they were bound to be conquered, and the other argued that if rebellions happened everywhere, they would have no need to defend themselves. The animals listened first to Napoleon, then to Snowball, and could not make up their minds which was right. Indeed, they always found themselves in agreement with the one who was speaking at the moment. At last the day came when Snowball's plans were completed. At the meeting on the following Sunday, the question of whether or not to begin work on the windmill was put to votes. When the animals had assembled in the big barn, Snowball stood up and, though occasionally interrupted by the bleating of the sheep, set forth his reasons for advocating the building of the windmill. Then Napoleon stood up to reply. He said very quietly that the windmill was nonsense and that he advised nobody to vote for it, and promptly sat down again. He had spoken for barely 30 seconds and seemed almost indifferent as to the effect he produced. At this, Snowball sprang to his feet and, shouting down the sheep, who had begun bleating again, broke into a passionate appeal in favor of the windmill. Until now, the animals had been equally divided in their sympathies, but in a moment, Snowball's eloquence had carried them away. In glowing sentences, he painted a picture of Animal Farm as it might be when sordid labor was lifted from the animal's back. His imagination has now run far beyond chaff cutters and turnip snippers. Electricity, he said, could operate threshing machines, plows, harrows, rollers, reapers, and binders, besides supplying it with its own electric light, hot and cold water, and an electric heater. By the time he had finished speaking, there was no doubt as to which way the vote would go. Just at this moment stood up and, casting a peculiar sidelong look at Snowball, uttered a high-pitched whimper of a kind that no one heard him utter before. At this, there was a terrible baying sound outside, and 9 enormous dogs wearing brass-studded collars came bounding into the yard. They dashed straight for Snowball, who only sprang from his place just in time to escape their snapping jaws. In a moment, he was out the door, and they were after him. Too amazed and frightened to speak, all the animals crowded through the door to watch the chase. Snowball was racing across the long pasture that led along the road. He was running as only a pig can run, but the dogs were close on his heels. Suddenly he slipped, and it seemed certain they had him. Then he was up again, running faster than ever. Then the dogs were gaining on him again. One of them all but closed his jaw on Snowball's tail, but Snowball whisked it free just in time. Then he put on extra spurt, and with a few inches to spare, slipped through a hole in the hedge and was seen no more. Silent and terrified, the animals crept back into the barn. In a moment, the dogs came bounding back. At first, no one had been able to imagine where these creatures had come from, but the problem was soon solved. They were the puppies whom Napoleon had taken from their mothers and reared privately. Though not yet full grown, they were huge dogs and as fierce looking as wolves. They kept close to Napoleon. It was noticed that they wagged their tails to him in the same way as the dogs had used to do to Mr. Jones. Napoleon, with the dogs following him, now mounted on to the raised portion of the floor where Major had previously stood to deliver his speech. He announced that from now on, Sunday morning meetings would come to an end. They were unnecessary, he said, and wasted time. In future, all questions relating to the working of the farm would be settled by a special committee of pigs presided over by himself. These would be met in private and afterwards communicate their decisions to the others. The animals would still assemble on Sunday mornings to salute the flag, sing Beasts of England, and receive their orders for the week. But no more dates. In spite of the shock that Snowball's expulsion had given them, the animals were dismayed by the announcement. Several of them would have protested if they could have found the right arguments. Even Boxer was vaguely troubled. He set back his ears, shook his forelock several times, and tried hard to marshal his thoughts. But in the end, he could not think of anything to say. Some of the pigs themselves, however, were more articulate. 4 young porkers in the front row uttered shrill squeals of disapproval, and all 4 of them sprang to their feet and began speaking at once. But suddenly the dogs sitting round Napoleon let out a deep, menacing growls, and all the pigs fell silent and sat back down. The sheep broke out into a tremendous bleating of 4 legs good, 2 legs bad, which went on for nearly a quarter of an hour and put an end to any chance of discussion. Afterwards, Squealer was sent round the farm to explain the new arrangements to the others. "Comrades," he said, "I trust that every animal here appreciates the sacrifice that Comrade Napoleon has made in taking this extra labor upon himself. Do not imagine, comrades, that leadership is a pleasure. On the contrary, it is a deep and heavy responsibility. No one believes more firmly than Comrade Napoleon that all animals are equal. He would be only too happy to let you make your own decision for yourself, but sometimes you make the wrong decisions, comrades, and then where would we be? Suppose you had decided to Snowball with his moonshine of windmills. Snowball, who, as we now know, was no better than a criminal. He fought bravely at the Battle of Cowshed, said somebody. Bravery is not enough, said Squealer. Loyalty and obedience are more important. And as to the Battle of the Cowshed, I believe the time will come and we shall find that Snowball's part in it was much exaggerated. Discipline, comrades, iron discipline. This is the watchword for today. One false step and our enemies would be upon us. Surely, comrades, you do not want Jones back. Once again, this argument was unanswerable. Certainly, the animals did not want Jones back. If the holding of debates on Sunday mornings was liable to bring him back, then the debates must stop. Boxer, who had now had time to think things over, voiced the general feeling by saying, "If Comrade Napoleon says it, it'd be right." And from then on, he adopted the maxim, "Napoleon is always right," in addition to his private motto of, "I will work harder." By this time, the weather had broken and the spring had begun. The shed where Snowball had drawn his plans of the windmill had been shut up and assumed that the plans had been rubbed off the floor. Every Sunday morning at 10 o'clock, the animals assembled in the big barn to receive their orders for the week. The skull of old Major, now clean of flesh, had been disinterred from their orchard and set up upon a stump of the foot at the flagstaff beside the gun. After the hoisting of the flags, the animals were required to file past the skull in a reverent manner before entering the barn. Nowadays, they did not all sit together as they had done in the past. Napoleon, with Squealer and another pig named Minimus, who had a remarkable gift for composing songs and poems, sat on the front of the raised platform, with the 9 young dogs forming a semicircle round them, and the other pigs sitting behind. The rest of the animals sat facing them in the main body of the barn. Napoleon read out the orders for the week in a gruff, soldierly style, and after a single singing of Beast of England, the animals dispersed. On the third Sunday after Snowball's expulsions, the animals were somewhat surprised to hear Napoleon announce that the windmill was to be built after all. He did not give any reasons for having changed his mind, but merely warned the animals that this extra task would mean very hard work and it might even be necessary to reduce their rations. The plans, however, had all been prepared down to the last detail. A special committee of pigs had been at work upon them for the past 3 weeks. The building of the windmill, with various other improvements, was expected to take 2 years. That evening, Squealer explained privately to the other animals that Napoleon had never in reality been opposed to the windmill. On the contrary, it was he who had advocated it in the beginning, and the plan which Snowball had drawn on the floor of the incubator shed had actually been stolen among Napoleon's papers. The windmill was, in fact, Napoleon's own creation. Why then, asked somebody, had he spoken so strongly against it? Here Squealer looked very sly. He said that Comrade Napoleon's cunning. He had seemed to oppose the windmill simply as a maneuver to get rid of Snowball, who was a dangerous character and a bad influence. Now that Snowball was out of the way, the plan could go forward without his interference. This, said Squealer, was something called tactics. He repeated a number of times, "Tactics, comrades, tactics," skipping around with a merry laugh. The animals were not certain what the word meant, but Squealer spoke so persuasively, and the 3 dogs who happened to be with him growled so threateningly that they accepted his explanation without further questions.